being here, everybody. My name is Dayna Scott. I'm a professor at Osgoode Hall Law School and cross-appointed to the Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change at York University. And we're super pleased to be hosting this event, which is part of the International Political Ecology and Economy Summer School this year at York. And we're very pleased to have two really important speakers for you this evening. The course this year is called Jurisdiction Back, Restoring Indigenous Governance in the Wake of Extraction. And it's been already 4 days dedicated to the discussion of strategies for getting jurisdiction back. And really complex discussions about the restoration of inherent Indigenous political authority of nations. And in that, we've opened up, as you might imagine, a lot of questions, complex questions about issues around land acknowledgements and universities. And so what we've decided tonight at this strange event, which is hosted by York University on the campus of the U of T, that we will recognize and work to build up the political authority of Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Huron-Wendat peoples who continue to govern lands and waters and peoples around us. So in order to introduce our speakers, we're very lucky tonight to have Professor Michelle Daigle, who's Mishkegawak from Constance Lake First Nation, and a professor and Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Geographies here at the U of T.
Thanks, Dayna, for that introduction and for the welcome. Wache, everyone, good evening. I hope you've all been having a wonderful week with the Summer Institute. Yeah, okay. So I'm really pleased to be able to welcome you to the keynote lecture this evening, and I'm especially delighted that I get the honor of introducing and celebrating tonight's esteemed speakers, Dr. Heidi Kiiwetinepinesiik Stark and Dr. Susan Hill. And so I'll start with introducing Dr. Stark, who is Ojibwe from Turtle Mountain and is an associate professor at the School of Indigenous Governance at the University of Victoria. She's previously served as the director of UVic's Center for Indigenous Research and Community-Led Engagement. She was a 2024 inductee into the Royal Society of Canada's College of New Scholars, and she was recently awarded a Tier 1 Canada Research Chair in the Embodied Politics of Indigenous Law. Dr. Stark's research centers Indigenous governance and treaty relations with a foundation in Anishinaabe legal orders and political thought. Her work also examines how Indigenous peoples continually reproduce our legal systems and practices amid or despite of gendered violence, violations of Indigenous consent, and the criminalization of Indigenous sovereignty. Her writing has been widely published in journals such as Theory and Event, American Indian Quarterly, the American Indian Culture and Research Journal, and she's also co-edited key texts in Indigenous studies, including Centering Anishinaabe Studies, published in 2013, and Indigenous Resurgence in an Age of Reconciliation, which was published in 2023. She's also the co-editor of NACE, the Journal of the Native American and Indigenous Studies Association. And Dr. Susan Hill is a Haudenosaunee citizen. Well, why don't we actually give a round of applause to Heidi? Okay. Dr. Susan Hill is a Haudenosaunee citizen from the Wolf Clan and Mohawk Nation from Grand River Territory. She's an associate professor and director of the Center for Indigenous Studies at the University of Toronto, where she's also appointed to the Department of History. She's currently serving her second term as the university's academic advisor on Indigenous curriculum and education. Dr. Hill's research centers Haudenosaunee history, Indigenous research methodologies and ethics, and Indigenous territoriality with themes that benefit Indigenous communities while expanding academic understandings of Indigenous thought and philosophy. She's the author of the book, The Clay We Are Made Of, Haudenosaunee Land Tenure on the Grand River, which was published by the University of Manitoba Press in 2017. Her book is a remarkable retelling of the history of the Grand River Haudenosaunee from their creation story through European contact to contemporary land claim negotiations, while examining the political role of Haudenosaunee women. The book won a prestigious Best First Book Award from the Native American and Indigenous Studies Association in 2018, and she later went on to serve as president of NASA from 2020 to 2021. Her writing has also been published in American Indian Quarterly and in the edited collection Lighting the Eighth Fire, which is where I first encountered her work as a grad student. And so why don't we also give a warm round of applause to her. And so I wanted to share some personal reflections because both Heidi and Susan are extraordinary theorists and mentors in the field of Indigenous studies. At the foundation of their extensive accolades is a commitment to build a field, but really a community of Indigenous researchers and teachers, along with allies, who can support the flourishment of our futurities by developing ethical research methodologies and community collaborations. And I think it's important to note here how both of their scholarship contributes to conceiving of research ethics from the starting point of land relations or land ethics, treaty making, and relational approaches to governance. Through my own experiences of working with Heidi and Susan, I can attest that their teaching, writing, and administrative leadership is grounded in an ethic of care that shines through in the way that they endlessly support their students, their colleagues, and the many staff members who are at the heart of our communities here on campus. I know they do this labor as they're balancing responsibilities and the everyday life work that's embedded in their respective communities, families, and extensive kinship networks. And they do all of this in a principled manner with grace and humility, which is why I have to gush about them this evening. So over the years, I've been fortunate and deeply grateful to teach with their writing, to learn from the way they carry themselves as leaders and mentors, and to be in their supportive presence in spaces that were quite simply just not intended for Indigenous peoples. They do the tireless work of creating Indigenous community and networks of care on campus while ensuring that academic institutions are accountable to Indigenous jurisdiction and treaty relationships. This is an embodiment of care that I understand as practicing governance here on campus, and that also builds on the labor, relationships, and politics that they enact within their respective nations. And so without further ado, I'd like to invite everyone to give a warm welcome to Dr. Stark and Dr. Hill with another heartfelt round of applause.
Well, bonjour and dinaway maganaduk. Everyone can hear us all right? Check that. So I first just want to start by also expressing my gratitude and thanks to all of you for joining us tonight. And my gratitude to Michelle Daigle for being with us and for her kind and incredibly generous introduction. Michelle's research and brilliance has deeply shaped my own thinking on jurisdiction and the restoration of Indigenous governance through an ethic of care, which will be readily heard throughout this talk tonight. She embodies these ethics of care in her modes of engaging with others, which is rooted in both a fierce kindness and gentle generosity that refuses to be hardened by the impacts of settler colonialism, no matter how acutely they may be felt in her community and daily life. I also want to acknowledge Dayna Scott, who has tirelessly worked to organize this event and the field course that's accompanied it. I've had the pleasure of working with Dayna for nearly 15 years and more closely in the last 6 years or so as we co-directed grants together. She's deeply committed to doing the hard work that it takes to support the restoration of Indigenous jurisdiction and embodies ethics of care in the ways she both holds up and makes space for others. I'm also so grateful to be joined by my dear friend Sue Hill, who graciously, even if perhaps regrettably, let me rope her into teaching this course with Dayna and I, and in joining me tonight in delivering this talk. Anyone who knows Sue knows she somehow knows everything. She literally is the switchboard of the Moccasin Telegraph, as well as an archive of rich community knowledge, made possible both because she's absolutely brilliant, but also because talking to Sue feels like coming home. These fierce women who join me tonight have taught me so much about what it can look like to restore an ethic of care in our governance as we work to assert and enact our jurisdiction over our homelands. They indeed make me want to at least be, if not, hopefully sometimes, achieve a better version of myself, in the hopes that I can be kinder, more gentle, loving, and compassionate in how I meet others. In many ways, it's their modes of relating to me, as well as the ways in which I watch them relate to others and to our territories, that I find answers and hope in the questions I seek to ask today, which is how do we cultivate an ethic of care? And so with that, I'm going to begin with a number of questions because I have very little in the way of answers. So what if we thought of law as generative instead of punitive? What would our laws look like if we aimed to cultivate something instead of correct it? To cultivate infrastructures of care and relational accountability. And this is not to say that we won't need frameworks for correcting behaviors, but what if we started with the notion of what we can cultivate in place of what we must correct? What if we thought of our legal traditions and governance as means to build the worlds we want to live in, as mechanisms to discover and hone our own individual gifts and the gifts of those around us, while contributing to our collective well-being? In reflecting on these questions, I'm reminded of the time I've spent not far from here with John Barrows and his community of Cape Croker teaching law camps. The elders there continually reminded us that Indigenous law lives within us. His mother, Anishinaabe elder Jean Barrows, spoke of the power of our legal tradition, saying, "If you teach them the principles, they will govern themselves." This vision of Anishinaabe self-governance reflects a legal order grounded not in coercion, but in relational understandings and modes of engagement. I think I'm looking at the wrong version here. We'll just keep going. As Elder Kiiwetinepinesiik of Chippewa of Neosh First Nation said, the kinds of laws that have to be written down and enforced using coercion against people are, in a sense, laws for the lawless, meaning that these kinds of on the books laws are alienated from the legal traditions and values, so that the laws have to be imposed externally upon people rather than the laws being part of a people's identity and way of life, as they may become when people are educated in the laws through stories and other means from a very young age. For Elder Kiiwetinepinesiik, like many Anishinaabe knowledge holders, externally imposed coercive legal systems are a deviation from Indigenous governance, where law is an embodiment of relationality, personal accountability, and ethics of care. But how do we make law a part of people's everyday, or a part of their embodied practices? How do Indigenous nations, in their efforts to revitalize our laws and the governing institutions that house these laws, contend with the impacts of colonization on our communities, institutions, legal orders, and relational practices? Can we imagine a future in which law functions more in its generative capacity? And what if we were committed to restoring Indigenous law and authority not as punitive tools that mirror the state, but as frameworks for how we can mobilize relational accountability and care, to produce a form of relational accountability that brings relatives back into relational modes of being. While Indigenous scholars have been able to make clear argumentation for the existence of Indigenous legal orders, and even work to extrapolate legal principles out of our philosophies, our stories, and our cultural practices, our law becomes ineffective if we cannot find ways to embody it in our everyday, in the ways in which we relate to one another, in how we care for one another, and how we come to make decisions about how to address harm and conflict as it arises in our communities. As our nations work toward the restoration of our political authority and legal orders in the face of state drives to contain, control, and regulate our daily lives, we must strive to do so in ways that don't replicate the very systems we continuously critique. Instead, we must orient our views of law away from these state models and towards more radical modes of relationality. We must move away from notions of individualism that separate out community accountability to both those that have been harmed and those that have done the harm. Indeed, if we live in a web of kin obligations, as many Indigenous teachings posit, then we must turn our minds to building up the infrastructures of care that give meaning to Indigenous law and produce relational forms of accountability that can exceed the binaries of victim and offender, right and wrong, criminality and legality. We must work instead to restore Anishinaabe legal responses to harm that focus not exclusively on punishment, but instead work towards repair, restoring our people to their whole selves. As Anishinaabe scholar Quill Christy Peters asserts, our wholeness requires us to experience presence within our bodies, but the ability to exist in a truly embodied state as an Indigenous person feels nearly impossible in a settler colonial world intent on the destruction of Indigenous life. She notes that many of us do not live in a constant state of wholeness like our ancestors did, but rather within various degrees or varying degrees of disembodiment. She reminds us that our entanglements with settler colonialism have resulted in many of us not being able to remain in our wholeness and instead seeking the protections that disembodiment provides. Indeed, in thinking about how law and governance can cultivate care, we must also attend to the harms that our communities have experienced. As Anishinaabe scholar Eva Jewell reminds us, producing Indigenous worlds through care is a necessary act for Indigenous futures, land back, language reclamation, and decolonization. Yet she notes Indigenous people have been systematically prohibited from socially and culturally reproducing our norms, behaviors, and embodiments, reminding us that while we are still culturally reproducing our worlds as Indigenous peoples, a culture that's both informed by respective Indigenous worldviews and felt experiences of surviving the various conditions of violence under settler colonialism, the mainstream social world that many of us live and interact with within is still a settler colonial world that does not reflect our values or ways of life. And I'm reminded of this story among the Anishinaabe of a woman who becomes a bear. And in this story, her husband hates her and decides to leave her and return to his family. Enraged by this, the woman transforms into a bear and goes in search of her husband. She finds his village, first killing his father, the chief, and then wreaking violence onto the community, killing nearly everyone. She then finds her husband, who tries many times to kill her, even setting her on fire. Yet she cannot be killed and escapes. And it's his little sister whom she then enslaves and tortures. The young girl, however, plays on the woman's vulnerability, telling her how amazing she is and how in awe she is in others' abilities to kill the bear woman. Flattered, the woman reveals that she cannot be killed because she hid her heart, telling her little sister that she placed it in her toe. The story concludes with the young girl telling the brother of his wife's vulnerability so he will be able to successfully kill her, which he does. So while I recognize the intense harm the woman was causing, indeed taking many people's lives, I also cannot help but feel a bit sad when I think about this story. And I wonder how often, because of our own experiences with harm, with hurt, with trauma, do we also look for ways to protect ourselves, to become disembodied? How often do we also hide our hearts, much like this bear woman? And as we see with her, what kinds of harms do we end up enacting upon one another because our hearts are no longer where they should be? When we're busy hiding our hearts to limit our own vulnerabilities and pain, we too can easily reproduce the very harms we seek to shelter ourselves from. So how do we bring our hearts back into the center of our law and governance? Indigenous scholar Chris Finley argues that inasmuch as colonization consists of damaging ruptures, decolonization relies on the attempts of the broken to love, care, tend, and heal relationships with our ancestors, our land base, and other people. Looking to the 2013 film Rhymes for Young Ghouls as a radical vision of decolonial love, Finley reminds us that a source of love, of care, can come from our ancestors, what she calls ghostly care. She reminds us that our ancestors are with us and can provide sources of care and protection when we are enveloped in families and communities that are struggling with having the capacity to provide the care needed. She states that one element of decolonial love and its formations of care, sociality, and relationality is that it extends beyond temporal and terrestrial realms, calling instead for restorative and wildly reparative otherwise visions and relations from and among ancestors, ghosts, and those who live in the ghastly thresholds of social life, the criminalized, the marginalized, and the disappeared. In analyzing the film, Finley understands both the young brother that passed away in a tragic accident and the father that's wrongfully incarcerated to protect his wife as ghosts who provide care for the central character, even in their absence. What might it mean then to turn to our ancestors as sources of care? Indeed, Indigenous governance is deeply relational and evidenced across many nations with reference to this, to the importance of 7 generations. And while some translate this to mean that we must govern with an eye towards the future by 7 generations, others have also referred to this teaching as one that operates across, or perhaps more accurately, outside the scales of linear time, with those of us living today as sitting in that 4th generation, looking back 3 generations and looking forward 3 generations. Within Anishinaabe-Moin, the word for great-grandparent and great-grandchild is the same. In Dunekubijigan, I always say that word poorly, meaning that I'm interconnected with or tethered to. So in some ways, to be umbilicaled, referencing the umbilical cord. Reminding us that Indigenous governance systems are rooted in relationality, reciprocity, and community accountability. These systems animate an ethic of care for the land, for our kin, and for the future generations, and in doing so, draw on our ancestors as sources of care and love to propel us forward. In consideration of how we might think of law through its generative capacities that can help cultivate infrastructures of care and animate relational modes of engagement, and in thinking about how our ancestors are not just those who came before us, but with whom we are tethered to in the present, I find myself often thinking to my own twin sister, who passed away nearly 14 years ago now. She taught me that our lives cannot be measured in time, but by those with whom we have touched and been touched by those with whom we are in relation. She spoke often of the wealth of care and love she had received, both in the final months of her life and over the years in which she had faced hardships and struggles. She refused to let the shortness of time diminish the deep, rich relationships that blanketed her and her family in both the times of hardship and in joy. Nonetheless, she also lamented the ways in which we often wrap one another in care when these hardships experienced are those that we deem as externally imposed. How when people struggle in illness, we tend to wrap them in care, but don't always offer these same levels of care when other harms are disrupting our lives. And this sentiment has also been expressed by Sarah Hunt, who's also questioned why our love for our lands will move us to fiercely protect our territories in the form of land defense and water protection, but that we often don't mobilize the same levels of care for our women and children when they are experiencing harm and violence. Asking why it is that we don't circle their homes with the same veracity and loving care that we often do our lands, ensuring that they too are protected. Quill Christie Peters also recognizes, again, our ancestors as important sources of love and care, noting, quote, importantly, to be whole is not some idealistic state of being that is free of pain and suffering. To be whole is simply to have access to all that we are and to be present enough, even if just momentarily, within our bodies so that we can feel our ancestors, our homelands, and the great beyond pulsing within us. Echoing these sentiments, Finley finds state approaches of care to be paternalistic and extractive, and argues that instead our work is to take responsibility for one another and recognize that our survival depends on collective wholeness, interdependence, and community care for each other. Furthermore, as Michelle Daigle notes, relations of care evoke full and fluid conceptions of Indigenous kinship that can exceed colonial territories and identities, such as First Nations reserves, treaty territories, geopolitical borders, and fixed notions of indigeneity and family. As she notes, these relations of care are mobilized and operate beyond territorial containers, enabling relation processes that sustain our communities and ensure we flourish. So to close, I want to turn to an Anishinaabe story about creation that can guide us in how we think about ethics of care. And it's funny because earlier I was making jokes about how out west we don't talk about Sky Woman, but now I'm going to talk about Sky Woman. So recounting Elder Doug Williams' telling of Anishinaabe creation, Leanne Simpson, in her newer work, Theory of Water, reflects on a part of the story where everything begins to go wrong and everything dies off. She's reminded of Doug Williams' simple, profound statement woven into his telling of creation, in which he states, "It could be that life is actually not that easy to keep." Anishinaabe creation reminds us of this in its various iterations. As Simpson reflects, Kiiwetinepinesiik makes the world and it's perfect and beautiful. And then something goes wrong. Everything dies off. The first time Kiiwetinepinesiik created the world, he did it alone. And it didn't work. Bothered and upset, Kiiwetinepinesiik was in no place then to go back to the earth and recreate. So Kiiwetinepinesiik asked another for help, one different from himself. He turned to Sky Woman, Kiiwetinepinesiik. And yet the first time she tried to repair creation, it also didn't work, and her 2 children died. And as the world flooded, she returned to Kiiwetinepinesiik to try to figure out what happened. Returning to the earth a second time, landing on the turtle's back, Kiiwetinepinesiik found a map, the 13 plates in the center and the 28 sections that surround it. Reminders of when the moon saw her beautiful reflection on the back of the turtle, and moved by the beauty and unaware it was her own reflection, she kissed the turtle's shell, these markings becoming reminders of the cycle of the moon across the sky for 28 days, 13 times a year. Simpson notes, it made visible movement and transformation and flux. It was an answer. Because of the map, Kiiwetinepinesiik stopped searching for the route to the new world and looked inside herself to make a crucial connection. The insight of the missing essence in Kiiwetinepinesiik's initial attempt at world making was cycling and spiraling and returning again and again. The missing essence, she says, was renewal and reciprocity. The turtle shell was a map to nowhere and a map to the whole world. And in many ways, when I came across this version of the creation and recreation, I couldn't help but reflect on the relationship between grief, care, and relationality that made these lessons all possible, that brought this knowledge forward. Our stories teach us all about the importance of for balance in our relationships. They also, however, highlight the precarity of the world we live in, reminding us of the importance of having relationships we can draw on when we come into times of need. These stories encourage us to always give what we can, to respond to others with generosity if we want to be met with the same form of generosity when we too find ourselves in need. But furthermore, these stories remind us that humans, and even the Creator, are fallible. That we too often cause harm, even when it is not our intention or aim. That we must take care in how we act. And indeed, we have a word or phrase that we'll often say, a directive in many ways, where we'll say, Ayang Guam is in, which is both a directive to take care, to be careful, to be cautious, but also to be thoughtful. Our stories often remind us of this, to remind us that we need to be thoughtful and act with care and generosity towards one another, that we have to actively work in our attempt to mitigate harm. We are also often reminded that we all experience the world from different places and positions that result in varied understandings of our stories, that we're encouraged to understand these differences as not only valid, but also important attributes, much like Kiiwetinepinesiik and Kiiwetinepinesiik, that brought together can bring forward unique as well as distinct insights. In this way, pluralism, we are reminded, is beautiful. And it reminds us that we can be understood and taken up in different ways if we don't act with care, if we don't foster and feed our relationships, as these living relationships require constant nurturing. And our stories teach us also that action causes transformation, that our engagements with the world and one another are always transformative. Something that can neither be measured as good or bad. Indeed, neither are the various characters that constitute these stories. Indeed, or I would say that, it's not to say that they're neutral either, but the focus instead is more on actions and the consequences that occur from them without placing a kind of value to those. And this is because in many ways, in recognizing our own fallibility, perfection is not the goal. Instead, as Simpson reminds us in her work, care is. So our legal traditions and governing systems have no doubt been deeply impacted by a history of colonialism, We have no doubt work to do to bring forward our own laws and traditions in meaningful ways that can attend to the various challenges our people and communities face. But too often, in considering how to restore our law and governance systems that have been impaired by colonization, we fail to also consider the impacts this colonization has had on our own people and our abilities to enact ethics of care. We must consider how this work has to be done simultaneously alongside the work of repairing relations across people within our communities, those who have been harmed and caused harm, that have strong forms of relational accountability and broken relationships, that have hidden our hearts and struggle in meeting each other with generosity. We must be reminded that to act with care towards one another is to also ensure we hold one another up, that we support one another in making the worlds we want to live in, that we cherish one another's gifts and work to cultivate these as we build the world anew. Now you get to see what that looks like in action.
Maybe in a little harsher way. Are folks okay? Do you need a stretch? Okay. I will share that we tried to have refreshments for this evening. Uber Eats was
Driving.
I don't know what they were doing, but they have canceled. I'm very sorry. I know that many of you are probably in need of a bit of a snack or a buzz in terms of some sugar. Not other buzzes that I'm going to be talking about tonight, but yeah, so I do apologize for that. We were raised better, but when we have to depend on others, these kinds of things happen sometimes. So I'm so impressed and amazed. Always with Heidi, I'll actually say, like, the very first gathering that eventually became NASA was in Oklahoma in 2007, and I fangirled over Heidi at that gathering. She did this awesome talk about Treaty 3 and about Haudenosaunee rights and responsibilities as framed in that treaty, and yeah, it was like the best talk at that conference. And I think that she was a little bit shocked that people were like, "That's so awesome," because you were still working on the dissertation, I think. Yeah, but yeah, so I've been following her around for 19 years.
And I've been like, yes.
So yes, but I also wanted to acknowledge and thank everybody who made this evening possible. And it's so nice to get to share some time and space with Michelle. We work together, but she's been on sabbatical, which has been lovely, but she's been very missed on campus. I think she has a sense of how missed she's been because the requests haven't stopped just because she's been on sabbatical. But we're really excited that she's back full-time on campus soon. And really happy that in the last moments of sabbatical, she came to be here with us tonight. Mm-hmm. So I wanted to acknowledge her for that. So as Heidi just brilliantly captured, when we're thinking about these ideas around Indigenous jurisdiction back, we're left to think about what does that actually mean. And I opted to take it from the question of what does it mean on the ground, literally and figuratively, and particularly in the context of my community of Grand River. I apologize, I should have started with a proper introduction of myself. Scanos Wagwego, Deowandate ni Gaso, Otahione ni Wagishauten, Ganyan Kyono ni Wakwenzident. So I come from the Grand River Territory, which is in theory about an hour and 20 minutes from here. In reality, anywhere from an hour and 20 to 4 hours, because Toronto people are crazy in terms of driving. And today I was reminded, I usually come in Spadina because my building is on Spadina, and that's my center point, right, when it comes to Toronto. But Google Maps said, take York. So
I got many texts about it.
So I took
I
York.
hate Toronto traffic.
And I'm really grateful I had a co-pilot with me, because York Street at 5 o'clock is pretty wild. Yeah, so a lot of accolades to those of you who work on this side of campus. It always feels rough on the other side of campus, but it ain't nothing compared to, no. Except on a Blue Jays game day, but yeah, that's a whole other. So as I said, I come from the Grand River Territory, and it is complicated for folks who aren't overly familiar with Haudenosaunee communities, in that we call our community Six Nations, but we're also all the Six Nations. So there's 17 Six Nations communities, although most other communities are the names reference the primary nation of the territory as well. But all of them are Six Nations territories. So Grand River is a little bit more specific. We are the only Haudenosaunee community on the Grand River. And in our language, we refer to our people as Onkwehonwe, which just means the people of the place of the willow trees. What you might pick out of that, depending upon your familiarity with geography in the Eastern Great Lakes, is that there's a few other places named Oswego, or some form of Oswego. And yes, it's because there's commonalities between those communities. I would say we are a lot more creative than our settler counterparts can be, where I don't know how many Yorks I need to see. There's a lot of recycling. At least our recycling makes sense. At least, well, to us anyway. But yeah, so I did want to preface what I'm going to share tonight as being specific to the Grand River Territory, but with a lot of implications, probably for all of our Haudenosaunee communities. But I don't know as much about what's happening in those other territories as I know what's happening at Grand River. Meg, would you mind? Thank you. So what I wanted to start with was thinking about some of the core principles that constitute Haudenosaunee philosophy and society. There's a lot more, but these are some of the core ones, and that I really wanted to think about in this context of our discussion around jurisdiction back. Our Great Law, which is our traditional government for the Haudenosaunee people, in fact, the Great Law is what makes us Haudenosaunee. It's framed under three principles, and those are Skana, Gaza Stansara, and Gatnigonrio. Or Gatnigonrio. Sometimes you'll hear people references it as Gaihuio. And they're all accurate. It's just about what you're particularly trying to highlight with what you're saying with that term. Another concept that I wanted to mention here, because I think it's highly relevant, it's also one that I think people might think sometimes I don't have as much of as I ought to, and that's the principle of Gendao, and that one's a Kiuga word. The other three that I gave you are in the Mohawk language. There's ways to say them in all 6 of our languages, but Gendao, I'm most familiar with that framing of the word, which is in Gayakono or Kiuga language, and that's about compassion. And there's a lot of stories around that teach us to have this, and really it's about patience and love and respect for others who may be struggling at times. It's not just about struggle though, but often when we're encouraged to have that Gendao, or to use Gendao, it's around trying to make sure that we're kind and compassionate to people who maybe are just learning something or who may be trying to overcome some challenges. Another core principle, and that really gets solidified through the Great Law, is our need for collective thinking. It's funny because our people, and particularly my nation, the Mohawks, we've got a bit of a reputation of being aggressive, shall we say?
Some might say that.
However, what the Great Law brought to us was this responsibility that if one wants to achieve peace, collective power, and a good mind, you have to bring your minds together. And so we actually that's why we talk about the good mind. It's not about like having 50 good minds. It's about coming together to form a single good mind that everyone is a part of. Some people might think, oh, that kind of sounds like the Borg. The difference, I would say, is that it's about goodness, which the Borg is not about that. But in the actions of making these things real, in order to get there, one has to demonstrate and live by principles that demonstrate a respect for life and for the things in the world that support life. And in our world, there's a lot of things that support life. They all come from what we would classify as the natural world. And it includes obviously things like water and food, and safety, a place to be that encourages and supports life. And that ultimately the best way to embody these things, to demonstrate that you hold up these principles, is by ensuring that the generations that are not yet born will have the same kinds of opportunities and privileges as you have. And this is the primary guiding factor that our leaders are reminded of when they're put into new positions of authority. So last month, we had a number of new Hoyane put into positions of leadership as men who speak for their clans. And they were put into those positions by the women who speak for their clans. We have this very balanced process for leadership that includes both male and female leaders for all of our clan families. And not just like a head woman and a head man, but also, and I think this is one of the most profound things about our people, is we also have 2 leaders for every one of these like chief clan mother roles. There's a man who's responsible for the ceremonies that will keep the family uplifted, and a woman who's responsible for those ceremonies. And it's not, in our language, we refer to them as workers. But they're the ones who make sure that the bodies and minds of their leaders have what they need to be their best selves as they lead the family. And so that's one of the pieces that I think is really profound about our society, is this idea of a leadership team that represents each clan family. There's a definite belief and expectation that nobody acts alone. And in fact, one who acts on their own will be reminded that they have responsibilities to their families, and that if the choices that they're making really are for the benefit of all people, then they ought to be able to get others to agree to what they're doing and to support them. And in council, a way that this ends up being enacted is that if one chief brings forward an idea to the council of what he thinks the Confederacy ought to do about a certain thing, if he can't garner the support of other chiefs in their deliberations, he's got a number of opportunities to do that. If he's not successful in convincing others that this is an action that will benefit the Confederacy, then his idea is basically defeated, because he wasn't able to achieve other support for it and then ultimately to achieve consensus for that item. And so it didn't demonstrate and hold up that ability for that collective thinking. Next, thanks, Meg. These are some points that came out of my research that I did from my dissertation that became my book. And I wanted to share these because I think these are highly relevant to what I want to get to. And so I looked at about 10,000 pages of community council records. So these were generated primarily from in-house documentation of the matters that were discussed by our leadership at Grand River between the period of 1847 and 1924. And I analyzed these through a whole review of what our traditional teachings say about how we're supposed to govern ourselves. And this is what I found evidence for in the decisions that our leaders had made in this period, and particularly in relation to land and how it was that we were governing our land at Grand River. Parents have a responsibility to provide for their children. There is probably not a greater wrong that a Haudenosaunee person can do than to abandon their children. That's not to say that it doesn't happen, and it's not to say that some people are willing to overlook it, but from a truly cultural perspective and from the directions that leaders are given, that is never acceptable. The next one that was very apparent in my analysis of the decisions that the council dealt with over this 80-year period, roughly 80 years, was that adult children have a responsibility to care for their sick or elderly parents and to provide for their needs. So what had been their birthright, that as children their parents had to provide for them, when they become adults, they then have a responsibility to take care of their adult parents, so long as those parents were good to them. There are lots of examples in the records where people were not deemed to have been the best of parents, and at which point their children weren't necessarily, that wasn't necessarily held against them if they didn't then stand up and take care of their parents. Spouses who maintain their marriage vows should be provided for upon the death of the other spouse. And that one's a little messy. I'm happy to have that conversation with folks though, but I'm not going to dive into that one right now. And last but definitely not least was the idea that landowners have to respect the property that they own. And I use own in quotes because it's very complicated in our languages. We don't really own anything, but certainly not land. But that you have to respect the property and not plunder the resources of it. And I want to point this out. There's actually some really great examples about gravel pits, which a lot of people I think take for granted. But it was a very hot topic at this time. I'll also say that if there's anybody here, I know there's at least a couple folks who are either from Grand River or have lived in the area or worked in the area. We have deposits of gypsum around our territory. And in fact, most of you, if you have wallboard in your house, or what are they, drywall, there's a very good chance it comes from my territory. And so the gypsum beds that might have been located on individual or like family plots of land, you couldn't just sell it off. There were actually rules about what you were allowed to take from that. And there were also fees that had to be paid into the council when you did that kind of thing, including also things like timber and the gravel and sand that I mentioned as well. Mike, thanks. Under the Great Law, and it's a very long story, I mentioned to the students who are here in the IPEE class that it takes about 9 to 12 days to tell the story of the founding of the Great Law in its full duration. Obviously, we're not doing that tonight, but there were 3 key areas in which our nations came together through this new government. And it became, first and foremost, we had a collective government, a common government. And I'm sharing here at the top left what's known as the Circle Wampum. And this represents our original clan families and the spokespersons, the men who meet in council on behalf of our families. We also established a common territory. And that's why I said it's difficult to sort of capture, because under the law, we have a collective territory. And that's captured in what's known as the Hiawatha or Ionwata Wampum Belt. You'll also see this on all kinds of things that might be a little questionable about whether or not that ought to appear on that. Most recently, it appeared on the jerseys of the U of T rugby team, because they were buddies with somebody who is from Grand River, who's the artist who designed their jerseys. I don't know what that artist was thinking, because I don't think there's any Haudenosaunee rugby players on the U of T rugby team. I could be wrong, but I've never met any. Really not an appropriate use of that item in that context, but I digress. The third commons that gets established under the Great Law is a common economy. And we actually documented that through what's known as the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt. You'll see lots of other iterations of Dish with One Spoon belts, but the original belt captured a common economy that was to exist between all of the nations of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. We've extended those principles to lots of other nations since then, but the original concept, this idea that we all share from the same dish, and that we do so that when we eat from that dish, we eat with a spoon, because we were told to not risk accidental bloodshed of our relatives from across the Confederacy. So that's why we use a spoon. Not because we want to make sure we slurp up everything, although we do, but because we wanted to ensure that there was no accidental bloodshed. And this is because we came from a time when we know that our ancestors were killing each other, and in some cases, even going as far as committing cannibalism. So this idea of sharing in a common dish of food and eating that food with a spoon, there's some really important metaphors at play there. Mike? So these days, and I'm sure that every generation of our people, probably at the very least for the last 400 years or so, might talk about the disruptions to our peace. And I'm not suggesting that there's never been disruptions to our peace prior to that we didn't have disruptions to our peace in our activities amongst other Indigenous nations. We certainly did. A lot of those nations have some pretty good documentation about some of those disruptions. But there were means to address those. But for the last 400 years, while there have been agreements about how it is that we address those affronts to our peace, the actual enactment of it hasn't been overly consistent. But there's lots of other things too that lead to a disruption of our peace. And probably one of the biggest ones is what we call mind changers. And these are things like anything that's going to change your rational ability to think. So alcohol, drugs, gambling, as examples. There's lots of others. I'm not going to give the whole list. I think you can think through what some of those might be. Next is individual aspiration versus collective benefit. Greed is probably a good English word to capture what that's talking about. And as I mentioned earlier, we have this primary responsibility that all of our actions are to support life. And so any actions that we take that don't support life disrupt our peace. And this would include things like violence to yourself or to others, because it's not just about what you do to other people. It can also be what you do to yourself. That can be an affront to that value. Damaging the natural world with no attempt to correct it. We all know that we make mistakes. When we're taught about harvesting medicines, for example, sometimes it may happen that we might pick the wrong medicine, or we might over-harvest a medicine, and those are not what we're supposed to be doing, right? But those things do happen. But then there are processes to correct those errors in judgment. And then finally, I think that it's valuable for us to be thinking about this fifth area, about the idea of taking advantage of other people's vulnerabilities. And I would suggest to you that in my community and probably in many other communities, that's an area we've been struggling with for a few centuries at least. We know that others who've come into our territories have certainly taken advantage in that way. But I would suggest to you that the things that hurt worse than any of that is when we do it to each other. And I would also suggest to you that with all of these things, while it's hurtful and harmful when others do this, I feel that it only becomes a true risk to jurisdiction and control of those things that we are responsible for is when we do it ourselves. That when others impede on our ability to govern ourselves, it stinks. But when we decide that we don't trust each other enough to govern ourselves, that's when we're defeated. So I'll get off the soapbox. Thank you. Next example, and I'm cutting through a bunch of different aspects of Haudenosaunee philosophy here, but these are all things that I hope will help to make sense in what I'm going to bring forward. In our languages, we have two different ways to say that we want something. And these may be used, both words may be used when we're talking about things like food or water. However, we can only use that second form when it's something that we need to support our lives. So If we want something just because we want it, then we use the term igere. So like, I might really want a piece of pie after supper. Is my life dependent on it? Probably not. And for those of our people who may be dealing with some other health challenges, in fact, it might actually go against their ability for their life to be of a high quality. But those things you want, igere. Those things that you need, Daigle. The root for that word talks about the earth, because we understand that the earth gives us everything we need to survive. We're really fortunate in this part of the world in that the natural world gives us everything that we need. We aren't folks who live in a highly vulnerable environment of extreme drought or extreme rains. It can happen, but it's not common and it's not typical. And there's almost always a way to get relief from those things. So as a result, we don't have ceremonies that require us to fast. We don't have ceremonies that require us to minimize our intake of food and or water, because in our philosophy and because our reality is that we have everything we need, and our responsibility is to be respectful to those things. And as long as you're respectful to those things, then you've fulfilled your responsibility. And so it very much informs our ceremonial practices and principles, as well as how we go about the world. Haudenosaunee people, one of the biggest things about us is that we've organized ourselves as an agricultural people. And in fact, between 60 and 70% of our pre-European contact diet was based on corn alone. Totally, about 90% of our economy was based on things that we were able to grow. So we are very much a plant-based economy, but it's plants that we've grown to sustain life. The other 10% is fish and meat. I'm a big fish and meat person, so I find a lot of joy there, but our economy really is based on our ability to produce food through the growing of plants. So just some points I want to make. Okay? So now tonight I would like to talk about commercial cannabis. I really wish I didn't have to talk about it, but I feel like we need to talk about it. And in our community at Grand River, it is a major disruption to our peace. And it's not, like, it's one thing when the adults are talking about it, but when your kids start talking about it, then you know you actually have to do something. These pictures actually on this slide these are photos that were taken this morning on my drive to take my son to school. This site is less than a mile from my house and on the route to his school. This is, as far as I know, the newest cannabis farm located at Grand River. There's a lot of ironies going on in this particular, with this particular enterprise, in that it is on farmland that belongs to a very active farming family. They're like very well-known corn growers. They also have cattle. So they're prominent farmers in our community, active in the Six Nations Agricultural Society, all these things. So when I saw these greenhouses start going up about a month and a half ago, I was like, no. Even though I will admit, the building in front and that's that new leaf that you see on the sign there, has been labeled that for about 7 years. I thought that that indicated that one of the kids was involved in the trade. I never expected that they would take family farmland and start growing pot on it, but they are. So my son took these pictures from my vehicle this morning. We rolled down the windows, and he's always he loves taking pictures, but he's not necessarily all that confident in his skill. And then he was like, oh, and it stinks. So a mile from our house, on the way to my son's school, this is what we have. There's probably other new ones that have popped up, but what often happens, and you can see it a bit in the photo on the right, they build these like dirt embankments. And so it's not real easy to kind of know what's going on. But they clearly didn't build these ones high enough, because it's been pretty obvious what was happening there. Next, Meg. The next one, and this is the one that's gotten a lot of press, is known as Legacy Farms. And I talked about this one at a gathering that Dayna and Heidi organized in the fall in Victoria. And this is the one that was a major catalyst in the community, because hundreds of trees were cut down in order to build these greenhouses that exist just on the edge of the village of Ohsweken. Less than a half mile from our grade 7 and 8 school in the community, within nose shot of our seniors housing, and just down the street from the Pentecostal church. Basically, none of their neighbors are happy about this. Interestingly enough, they are distant cousins to the farm that popped up, but I don't think, honestly, that the two operations are connected. I could be wrong. But with this farm, so they started building it just over a year ago. They tore out hundreds of trees and then covered, I think, almost every inch of the lot with greenhouses. There are over 40 greenhouses on this section of land. The neighbors talked about getting flooded that spring because the rains weren't able to be absorbed as they normally would be. And so there was all of this overflow of water onto their neighbors' properties. Most of those neighbors are also cousins, by the way. Next. And I took these pictures this morning too, by the way. So there's all of these signs that you're not allowed to like get close to the greenhouses. And I didn't risk it because I don't like confrontation. But I took this picture, and this must be one of the signs that one of the cousins put up. And I loved it. If folks are having any issues reading, I'll just read it quick. Attention, environmental disaster, welcome to hell on earth. And I will tell you that at the peak of summer last year, if you drove into the village, and by the way, the village is like kind of the center of the territory. It's the largest concentration of homes in the community. And as I said, there's a large number of seniors that live in the area because there have been housing projects that have been created to help support folks who might have some accessibility issues. But so I don't know anybody who likes this project, and they have to smell it literally day in and day out. It's worse in the mornings, I'm told. It's very unpleasant, at the very least. Next. So last fall, very early, our Confederacy Council issued a formal statement about the cannabis business in our territory. Now, mind you, A lot of us, I think, were hoping for an earlier statement. These are only excerpts from it. If you're interested in looking at the full statement, it's available at HaudeNishoneeConfederacy.com. But I wanted to provide these particular excerpts because I think what they demonstrate are the ideas that I've shared already. This idea that, first and foremost, cannabis is not one of our traditional medicines. This is the biggest debate that I see in the Facebook conversation chats and whatnot. A lot of people want to believe that it is an original medicine, and it is not. The plant that they cultivate for this purpose has been modified. It is not hemp. The Tuscarora Nation, which is one of our nations, they're known to be the hemp shirt wearers. They're, for a long time, lived in the Carolinas, and they were known as these people who wore shirts, and it was shirts made out of hemp. And so there have actually been court cases where people have started to say, oh, I'm Tuscarora and therefore I have a right to cultivate this crop. Those cases have been in the States. They have not held up, fortunately. But it's really important for people, and especially, like I said, my 14-year-old son is becoming increasingly aware of the cannabis industry just around the corner from our house. It's easy to convince people who don't know otherwise that this is something traditional. We're an agricultural people. We trust stuff that comes from the ground. So I wanted to highlight that statement. Also highlighting the impacts around dependency that our chiefs were calling out in their statement, and the ways in which mind changers in general have been used as a tool against our people. That idea of disrupting our collective peace, encouraging individual gratifying, I guess, over the idea of being able to live collectively. And so they wrap up their statement talking about being in fullest opposition to the establishment, operation, and expansion of the cannabis industry. And then a calling upon our people to honor those things that our ancestors gave us. So they're not saying listen to us. They're saying listen to our ancestors. We are just bringing forward those things that we know we've all been instructed to understand and live under. And then the final statement about that if you decide to still involve yourself in this industry, that you cannot use our collective values and identity as a justification for that activity. Next, please. Prior to last week, the Six Nations elected council, and I should preface it because most people probably won't know this, for 102 years at Grand River, we have had two different governing bodies in our territory. One, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy Council, which is the established government from the time of the founding of the Great Law, and the other being the Six Nations of the Grand River Elected Council. That's what they call themselves these days. It changes sometimes. Who were put into power under the Indian Act in 1924. So since that time, we've had two competing councils. In most cases, they do not even acknowledge the presence of the other. In some cases, they do, but again, it's usually not with anything kind to say to each other. Prior to last week, the elected council had allowed the cannabis industry to operate in the territory, and they regulated the operation in our territory. That said, I will point out that the vast majority of the cannabis industry in our community has not been regulated by anybody. Legacy Farms, the one with the Hell on Earth sign in front of it, does operate under a license issued by the elected council. And so that's why I wanted to particularly raise this point. In their statement last week, elected council said they're no longer going to regulate it. But they haven't said what that means. I would suggest to you that the history has shown us that it simply means things will continue without anybody doing anything until somebody does something. And often that somebody doing something is the Ontario Provincial Police enacting their authority. But that doesn't happen smoothly in our territories. And in fact, for quite a long time, you would never see an OPP officer in our community. We have our own police force, and they have a relationship with the OPP. And any policing matters that needed to be dealt with in our territory would be handled by the Six Nations Police. It's very unclear what this is going to mean. I would suggest that it's probably going to mean a lot of lawlessness for probably quite a long time. And I think that might actually be my last slide. So I don't come here with solutions per se, but I'm pointing out what I see as some pretty glaring contradictions to what's happening in my community. I would also suggest to you that none of this would be happening if Canada took their responsibility that they have through our treaty relationship to ensure that their people are not benefiting from this. Because I will tell you, while a good number of folks in my community are certainly consumers of cannabis, it's not enough to fuel 40 greenhouses worth of product. People from outside of our community are those who are really benefiting. And not just as consumers, but the co-owners of the businesses, including the farms. All of the farms that I've been able to find information on, there's co-owners who are not from the community. Many of them who have questionable standing to be in Canada overall. Legacy Farms, I found, was actually based in North Carolina. So I have no idea what the co-owner of Legacy Farms, what their legal right is in Canada. I'm sure that they've done the paperwork to cover their bases, but I'm sure that there's some questions. At the very least, it is certainly not exclusively Haudenosaunee people benefiting. And it's definitely not Haudenosaunee people broadly benefiting. Although there was an interesting post on social media, I couldn't find it again, about the $320,000 that Aaron Porter, who's the community member owner of Legacy Farms, distributed amongst the community last year. $320,000. Thoughts about what kind of income might have been generated from 40 greenhouses worth of cannabis? Unless it's crap product, it's multiple millions. Yeah, so I'll stop there. Sorry for my, I think I went a bit over.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you to both of our scholars that we have with us tonight. And, I think there's so many interesting ties into the theme of the course we've been doing overall, where we've been talking about these complex issues of Indigenous governance and who has authority in respect of certain activities or matters in particular places, about that authority coming from the knowledge of the place. And also interestingly, in terms of we've been thinking in the wake of extractivism. And as Sue was talking, I was wondering about that phrase, like in the wake, meaning like it's behind us, that thing, extractivism, And when we think about the logic of extractivism, right, and often apply it to things like minerals or timber, oil and gas, right? But the scholars have been telling us, of course, this logic extends much more broadly from that. And I think Sue's example, of a plant becoming a commodity in this way is such a good example of how that logic is extending around us. Also, I couldn't help thinking about the interconnections of, our urban communities and Indigenous territories and the way those connections continue, and also the intertwined lives of our children and young people on all sides of this example. Thinking also here of Heidi's notions of holding people in care, right, and how complex that is in terms of thinking through all of these new interconnections and types of extractivism that are coming around us and at us at all times. Similarly, in those very last remarks that Sue was making, I was thinking a little bit about the real push towards Indigenous equity and partnerships as being, a kind of a forward-moving, a forward-thinking way of moving into these kind of troubled economic times, and equity sometimes being thought of as sort of the gold standard of consent, right? The highest form of consent, and how we might think about that in terms of jurisdiction and against these complications of governance. So we have some time for questions, and I can moderate or take a list if people want, but you can just raise your hand and we'll take about 20 minutes. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you both for that. I, in my own work, am sort of obsessively trying to untangle ideas around scale. And I guess I'm wondering, I've been reading a lot about the idea of scale as different sets of relations and different sets of obligations. And I'm wondering if either of you could speak to maybe are some of the principles and Indigenous laws that you've been discussing, are they scalable? How do they scale? Should they be I'm thinking particularly, Emma Singh talks about scalability and how scalability sort of means isolating something from relationality. And given that this is all sort of so deeply rooted in relationality, I'm wondering if when we're thinking more broadly, if that's possible or how we would approach that.
So I'm not sure if this quite gets at your question, but I think in my own work, I've been trying to think through what it could look like to restore forms of relational accountability, and have been thinking about that through what I would consider a particular kind of scale. A lot of Anishinaabe teachings, I think, operate at this scale of kind of 4 levels, which is the relationship to the self, which I think was really present in Sue's last slide about the degree of kind of self-determination and governance we have over ourselves, but then the ways in which that's tethered to the collective, where then it's if you're going to continue to do this, now this other scale of folks will not then be accountable or responsible for that. So I often think of it as the self, the family, the community or nation, depending, and then outward to other nations. And that of course like entails our other than human relatives, that we also have particular responsibilities and obligations too. So when I think about scale, I think less about how we take something and like expand its reach or its applicability, and more about the kinds of webs that we operate within and the ways in which like they're all kind of activated at the same time, but the hope is that we'll like mostly learn to govern ourselves in well enough that our relatives will not then have to bring us back into particular ways of relating. And so like when we fail to do that, it's then often on our family to then have to try to call us in. When they are unable to do so or not in a position to do so, then it's the community that will often step in. And then at times if that cannot happen, then sometimes it's those external forces. So I'm not sure if that helps in any way, but is one of the ways I think about scale. And then, you know, Sue's presentation, one of the things she brought up a lot in the fall that she wasn't able to get to today is the ways in which cannabis then is also like displacing all the food sovereignty work that has been going on in their community. Like that it's not just about cannabis, but about what's being displaced in the process, and what kinds of relationships with food are being displaced. But also like this, like when you think about scale, like sometimes when we are engaged in activities in which we cannot then keep those four scales of governance in operation, what often happens is like the feds step in. And we've seen that with tobacco, we've seen that with gaming operation, like both of these in the States as well. Like it's often when those things are not being regulated and governed well enough internally or in ways that the state can recognize, they will use that to like strip us of more and more of our own political authority and jurisdiction, right? So I just want to like note that for perhaps any of the consumers in the room, that like this is not just about value attached to cannabis itself, though it's not outside of that, but that like it does displace something else, which is why I think so much attention was given to corn and the various other kinds of food production that are so central to Haudenosaunee and other communities' ways of life that are being displaced through this process. Yeah, and this has been a big issue in a number of Anishinaabe territories too that have had to really consider whether or not to engage in like cigarette production, right? Because we think of tobacco as sacred, and a number of us are also addicted to commercially produced tobacco. And it's a massive revenue generating thing, right? So these are the, like, so when we also think about scale, like I think there's different scales in which we want to think about how our own values and principles are operating both alongside and against capitalism, you know? So, yeah. I don't know if you have anything about scale.
No, I think that was good.
Okay.
My question is this better? My question is about this is talked about climate changers and what you talked about things that harm us, but we might use to harm others. I think all of that kind of comes together in the realm of social media, and I want to present to you a question about some ethics around what we should be mindful of, as social media is highly addictive as a mind changer, but also like how do we how might Haudenosaunee people and Anishinaabe people sort of think about not having sovereignty when it comes to engagement with social media, particularly now when children have such ready access generation of artificial videos that can't even differentiate real from fake. Like I'm really concerned about children as I ask this question. So I'm going to present that to you and how I think about this in terms of law and self-governance.
I'll start, and then I'm sure Heidi will be able to wrap it. It is really interesting to me, and I'll admit, like, I'm of the Facebook generation, so like not a ton of folks my age are like real heavy into other platforms, but Facebook is like what has our attention, most definitely. And I would say, I think probably it tends to be a very common Native American, First Nations platform that like it tends to be the go-to platform. I know for the youngsters it's not, but most people, I think 30 and up, it's still pretty common.
The rest are snapping, right, or something?
Yeah, Insta, and, yeah. And it definitely has taken over as a primary communication tool for a lot of us. And I don't think we fully grasp the intellectual property ownership component of it. All of that said, like I think there's still like usefulness to it, but moderation. And that's like, again, I think probably most Indigenous nations have teachings about moderation. But it's a lot easier to be moderate in general for once you're of a certain age. 12-year-olds, there's no moderation. Yeah, no, it's very difficult. And I think that it's an area that we really have to get a much stronger grasp on. And then also, but even like for all ages, to think about the ways that we allow it to be weaponized. And really thinking about how this contradicts our values and what we're going to do about it. Yeah, and I wish I had the answers to that, but yeah, so I fully agree with what you're saying, but I do believe that there is usefulness in it along with that moderation. But it's probably because I've become quite dependent on it for information. To be honest, like I'll own that. I do have friends who have completely left social media, and they're like in their like
And then they have to call Sue to know what's up in politics.
in their departing messages, they're like, call me up sometime. Yeah. Like, I was very impressed, a younger man in the community who does like some really wicked, cool environmental stuff. He like, Snap was his last sort of platform that I knew that he was engaged in. And last week he was like, I'm done, call me and I'll come visit. Which is, you know, like as a young single dad, with a pretty intensive job, I was impressed with him for that. And now I've like got to write down to make sure to like call him to set something up as a visit, right? Because it's been just really easy to follow what he's doing, and not actually have to talk to him, right? So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I would say I do share many of those concerns, especially around generative AI. None of us may have jobs pretty soon. No, just kidding. But I will also say I remember that when I was in college, during my undergrad, there were lots of debates about whether or not our Indigenous languages should be taught in universities, and lots of debates about what we should be writing down. And then, like, more recently, one of the elders who's now passed on in Minnesota, like, recorded parts of our like funeral tradition that people would never have done. And he was like, first of all, you have to speak Ojibwe fluently to even begin to crack anything in here. And he was like, all I care about is that these guys can bury you when you die, you know. And that was his like for us, you cannot get there if they cannot tell you where to go, you know, so I would say I think these threats have always been here, and the difference is that things are just moving at a speed that is hard to like kind of grapple with, though I would imagine we've also always been concerned at the increasing speed at which things move. And so to me, the answer is like, we just have to build the worlds we want. And if we want our kids off of, I mean, I say this and don't do it because I'm old and tired, but like if we want our kids to be out on the land, we have to take them out on the land. If we want them to know how to do things, we have to like make sure we do that work, and that work is really hard. And so finding ways to make it, like to remove the barriers that like can make it more possible for us to build the worlds we want will hopefully then push us away from some of these things, or at least more in moderation, and towards other ways of connecting with one another. So, yeah.
You may not be able to answer this question fully, but I'm just, there's lots of debate on, let's say, the participation of, or the uptake of capitalist systems and extractive economies within certain First Nations or Indigenous communities to, for example, drive their own economy. And some perspectives say that it's merely another iteration of an act of colonialism to say that certain communities cannot participate if they wish to do so within those capitalist structures. So maybe not your personal answer to it, but I'm just wondering if you have thoughts on how you navigate that kind of question or those tensions within those various perspectives, you know, across the country. Like I said, you may not be able to answer, but I'm just wondering on how you think through those kind of debates.
While you're thinking, maybe I'll take a few questions and then turn it over to you guys for concluding remarks.
Sure.
Okay. Is that okay?
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead.
Hi, thank you both so much. Heidi, you were talking about Quill's book on wholeness and this idea of embodiment, disembodiment, and then you were sharing the story about Bear Woman, and you said becoming disembodied as hiding your heart. And I was thinking about how in the academy, like, intellectual work can be so disembodying in the way that we do it now, and even teaching and being a student and all those things can be so disembodied. And so I was wondering if the both of you could share a little bit more about how your pedagogical practices try to counter that. Like, what does embodied teaching or learning look like for you?
And is there two more maybe or so? There's two. Let's go at the very back. Yeah, go ahead.
Thanks again, Professor Stark and Professor Riddle. My question is just about regulation of cannabis, and I guess what you think, what is to be done, and whether some sort of like agreement should be reached to create a more equitable distribution of revenues to the community, if that would be something to work toward, or is it, I guess, stepping into kind of limit the amount of, or limit cannabis consumption and production within Six Nations?
And let's take our Blue Jay fan back there, and that's maybe all we have time for. Sorry.
Thank you again for your presentation. My name is Ken Robertson, the Spirit Davis School Bear House, Bear Clan, Territory, Shawnee Nation, way over there. So I wanted to get back to sort of your group of the governance styles that are implicated in the community right now. Right now you have ISC under the Indian Act, and then you have the traditional, practice, for time immemorial. And you mentioned before how they collide, or sometimes don't acknowledge, or acknowledge sometimes, depending on where you are today, kind of moment, or in that real time. So again, the sort of take back is, going back to the piece, how can these two worlds work together, or try to strive for a better community in a sense? Because right now I come from an unseen territory, right? But it's still under the Indian Act, from the time of birth and death, we all fall under the Indian Act as it says policy, right? But then you go to treaties where, for instance, your treaty gives you your right to access the land, who does what with it, how to operate it. So that's sort of my question, these two worlds collide, because right now, in my world, it is sort of getting the potlatch back into our community, back up west, but at the same time, it's coming back in those slow increments as we are still decolonizing.
Thank you. What do you guys?
So I'll actually pick up from that statement, and I think that what you touch on there really, in my view of things, is the key, is that we cannot possibly govern ourselves as independent nations, whatever that may be, right? From my perspective, we can't govern ourselves as Haudenosaunee if we don't know what it is to be Haudenosaunee. If we're not raising corn, we've lost a central element of who we are. And I'm not suggesting necessarily that corn's the answer to everything. What I'm saying is that we cannot find the answer if we're not doing those things that make us who we are. And so that does mean we have to grow corn. And growing corn isn't just about growing corn, right? Like, it's all kinds of things and knowledge that goes with that. And that actually, I think, gets at that question about embodied knowledge, right? That it's in the doing. And as Heidi alluded to, sometimes the doing is not as much fun as you want it to be, and it definitely will go up against your desire for sleep and an easier lifestyle, shall we say. But our ancestors didn't survive the onslaught that they survived by chance. They survived it because they had been given the skills to do so. And if we want to make sure that our generations in the future get the chance to exist, then we've got to make sure that they know how to survive. And they have to do that through us doing that hard work, right?
Yeah, just to follow up though, because my son was actually at UT taking the Indigenous course. And my grandmother was always talking about surviving the winter. So that was part of the cycle, going back to the celestial, for instance, the 13 moons. We're out of sync, she always said. That we have to get back in sync with nature and the moons. And they told us when those times were to harvest or to rest or to start over again in the spring, for instance. So, and that's where I'm looking for the future for my son. When he becomes involved in these great discussions of debates and writing policy, that's why it's important and imperative. Where we're still learning that Western lens too, right? And I'm still trying to hold on to that holistic approach as well. That those two worlds are playing, or as I say, they're both sides of the tracks of things.
A lot of that economy is about how to make sure things are easier. But one of the things we have seen is those things that are about making our lives easier actually make us less and less capable of knowing how to provide the things we need for ourselves. Like, most of us in this room cannot grow our own food. Okay, maybe I'm just speaking for myself, but I doubt it. Cannot hunt or not surviving the apocalypse. We're gonna go find Sue's people and be like, I hope you have lots of corn and no, just kidding. But that it gets us away from the skills that actually not only show us how to live and be in relation with the world, but actually how to then have what's the word I'm looking for? Extra, to have abundance. And it's abundance that is generated through caring and giving to others, that then always brings this stuff into your life. And that was something that Mandy McDonald was sharing some of her work around moose hide tanning, talking about the ways in which it wasn't that that the best way to combat a mindset of scarcity is actually to meet it with abundance. And that if you just give and give, it will often then enable the modes of engagement with one another that will produce all the things you'll need. So with that, I do feel like whether nations choose to engage in certain capitalist economies or not, the question is really like, what are the things that we say are what we want for our children? What are the things our children want? And have we found a way, I mean, I've been on this soapbox, I think, all week too, which is like, have we found a way then to like build up those things so our people have work they can go into that adheres to our own values and traditions, so that we're not telling our young people we want them to like know our teachings, know our language, and then there is no economy for them to go into. So in some ways, I think our communities would benefit from thinking about how to build up the economies of those things we value, which is engaging with our territories, our language, our culture, our teachings. And a lot of that in relation to embodiment and teaching and learning could happen if we thought more creatively about how to engage in more land-based learning. And, you know, universities are struggling to do that. I think many of us working within universities struggle to do that because it's actually really, really expensive. But there's lots of ways we can all do that in our everyday, whether you're in Toronto and it's covered by cement or you're like out in the bush. And part of that is like, I mean, gets back to the device, which is like, just look up. Like literally the amount of people who I almost run into on the road because they're like on their phone, you know. So some of that is also about actually just forcing ourselves to like recognize that we're always in relation all the time, and we are surrounded by like both people and other than humans at all times that we could be engaging with, no matter what the spaces are we are traversing. Like one of the reasons we wanted to teach here in Toronto is to remind everybody that Toronto is Indigenous territory, right? That this is Indian country in its like most complex and layered forms. So I think I'll just stop. That was my best attempt at answering 4 questions. Yeah, I did it. While preaching. No, I'm just kidding.
So just in closing, real gratitude for like, I think what's been demonstrated right here is like these folks have embodied this generosity and love for the whole week and really been putting it out. And, you know, I think the, you know, Heidi made a wisecrack today about the PVC piping, and now, as has been typical all week as well, it actually turns out to be like a really profound point that she circles back to again later. And we've been witnessing that like humor woven through all of the really smart theory and insights that have been coming out. So I hope you all appreciated that as much as I did tonight. I want to say thank you to all of our students for being here, and to everyone else who joined us. Of course, Michelle Daigle, thanks so much. I know you had just a crazy week, so we really appreciate you coming and joining us tonight. Of course, Sue and Heidi, I appreciate. Megan's been helping us for the whole week and she just had to step out. And of course, everyone else, thank you so much for coming and contributing to this event. I'm sure we'll all be able to stick around for a minute or two and ask some more of those questions I didn't get to. Okay, so thanks again.